Hello, listeners of Jacqui Just Chatters. This is your hostess, Jacqui Lents. This is my ongoing bonus mini-cast murder mystery serial. I hope you enjoy. To Silence a Scandalmonger, Murder in an English Village. Play along as you step into the role of one Gwendolyn Armstrong, who is living in 1951 Oxford, England, and is in the final months of earning her bachelor's degree in history from St. Hugh's. Your post is full of regular letters from your Aunt Ivy and other occupants of the charming village of Upper Stock Green. On the surface, it seems a serene picture of stone cottages, beautiful green countrysides, and charitable neighbors. But underneath, in the darkness, a sinful world hides, and the shadow beats the heart of a murderer. By the time the last letter arrives, can you identify the killer? Letter number 1 to Gwen from Aunt Ivy.
8th of January, 1951. Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. Dear Gwenny, hello, my darling niece. I hope you are staying warm. We've had a bit of snow here of late. The rooftops and hedgerows look as if they are dripping with icing. As long as the paths are not too icy, it is very pretty to look at. Has it been snowing as well in Oxford? I hope you are working hard at St. Hugh. I do miss you terribly. Since your parents' passing, I have tried my best to fill their void. I can't imagine your father would approve of you using your inheritance to get this higher education. But since you have been so determined to follow this path, I am certain you want to be a credit to your family and not waste their money. It was still a bit shocking that at 20 you went off to university, when most girls that age are becoming wives and mothers. You always did have an independent streak in you. I think that came from your mother's side. I don't recall many rebellious Armstrongs. It was delightful to have you finally come and stay over the Christmas holidays. The visit cheered me up no end. I believe my favourite part was trimming the tree. I haven't bothered with the Christmas tree for many years, with just myself there. Didn't seem much point. What a lark it was! How brave you were, teetering on the chair to get the star on the top. I admire your balance. The star was always a job of either Uncle Herbert or Daniel. I still cannot understand why the Lord saw fit to take both my husband, son, and your parents in the last decade. You were the last family I have. It felt like forever since I'd last seen you. I am sure the leaves were starting to change and Mrs. Owens was baking you fresh apple tarts on the previous visit. Though I do appreciate your letters keeping me up to date on your activities and such. I must admit the bits you put in about what you are reading for your classes do go over my head and bore me a little, but some of us are not meant for that kind of thing. I decided on the more traditional path, marrying your Uncle Herbert and having your cousin. Alas, now I am alone due to those evil Nazis and Herbert's stroke. I suppose not totally alone, though. You did come for a visit at last, and I hope you enjoyed your time as well. I am planning that you will come back for the Easter holiday. It seems during those times that family is most important. I was glad that mincemeat rations were lifted, and I could make my famous mince pies for our holiday celebration. There wasn't a single leftover pie by the end of the night. I observed that 2 of the local gentlemen seemed to be paying you a great deal of attention. Who am I referring to? Don't play coy with me, young lady. I'm talking about Constable Freddie Allen, for starters. You two seem to spend a great deal of time discussing your mutual love for Sherlock Holmes. Is that considered a topic for discussion about courting couples these days? Back when your uncle and I were sparking, he told me my eyes were like emeralds and my lips like rose petals. He quoted Byron and not Arthur Conan Doyle. Maybe Freddie needs more practice. That cosy conversation, however, did not stop you from dancing with Mr. Lucas Davies, our country solicitor. Those Mr. Glenn Miller records you brought home had the two of you cutting a rug. I don't know if it is a decent thing having a solicitor who can dance as smoothly as Mr. Davies. But you two did make a lovely pair to watch. I may have reservations about this fancy education of yours, but Gwen, dear, I must admit I enjoyed those records of yours more than I thought I would. I have shocked Mrs. Owens, my housekeeper, by having listened to some of those Mr. Miller songs on the radio since you left. She admonished me to act my age. Since I don't pay her for her opinions, she can keep them to herself. You were too busy twirling with Mr. Davies to notice young Freddie. There is that saying about if looks could kill. I can't imagine that Freddie is going to be very friendly with Mr. Davies any time soon. Does either of these young men interest you, or were you just having a holiday fling? I know you think it is none of my business. But, dearest, in a small village like Upper Stock Green, my neighbour's business is mine, and vice versa. You can like it or lump it, but that's how things are. Send me more news soon, and make sure that you are avoiding any socialists. I hear things on the wireless. Love, Aunt Ivy.
Letter number 2. To Gwen from Aunt Ivy.
20th of January, 1951. Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. Dear Gwenny, hello, my girl. I just finished your latest letter. A woman professor. Will wonders never cease? Does she wear dresses or trousers like a man? I don't suppose she's married. I hope this isn't giving you fanciful ideas. You are finishing your degree this spring. I was just remarking to Mr. and Mrs. Bailey, who run the post, that you were nearly done. Sharing, you would be the first female in the Armstrong family to have a degree. I also expect you to finish with honours. You'd better do well on your exams, dear. You don't want to make your aunt a liar. They said to me, "Oh, Mrs. Stevens, many girls nowadays have advanced schooling," implying your efforts were not a big accomplishment. Tosh, as if I don't know the real reason that their daughter Iris, who was 16 at the time, mind you, left secondary school before the end of term was over last year. In fact, she never completed her education, even when she returned home. The official word was poor health, and that she was going to a sanatorium up north to recover. There was nothing wrong with her health except the usual problems that come from running around with too many fellows. She was a loose girl. When she finally came home, she looked more tired and worse than when she left. I know she was in the family way. Mark my words. I have yet to figure out who the father was, but I am keeping my eyes open. I am sure he will reveal himself. I had to set my pen down for a moment. Mrs. Owens has just come in. What news? Now I know I am not one to condone the spreading of gossip. I do think Mrs. Owen is a bit prone to the habit, but I think that's part of her Welsh heritage. However, this is not merely tittle-tattle. Mrs. Owens saw this with her own eyes. She was going to the back door of the Quivering Leaf pub for some sausages. I know you don't approve of these creative solutions we villagers have come up with to deal with the rationing, but one does need sausages on a regular basis for a proper breakfast. Mr. Gibson, who runs the pub, has been doing a swift business in procuring and selling items that many of us require, which we cannot get in a traditional manner. I admire his industry, and I'm happy I can treat myself from time to time. You ate every meal placed in front of you last month at my table. I won't take any finger-wagging from you. I remember you sneaking extra biscuits from my jar when you were little, and I never told your father. So I expect you to keep silent on this matter as well. Back to my point. It seems that Mrs. Owens, from her vantage point at the back of the shops, saw the vicar, you remember, Reverend Fernsby, and Miss Ada Berrycloth, the lady who runs the tea shop, holding hands and staring into each other's eyes. Apparently looking something out of the movies, it seems. Mrs. Owens swears it definitely did not look like it was a case of a vicar giving counsel, but more of a paramour situation. I would imagine this would be a great surprise to Mrs. Fernsby if she found out about it. It seems she is in Hampshire visiting her sister for the week. Given that they were observed before shops have opened, I speculate that the good Reverend was leaving Miss Berrycloth's apartment after spending the night. She lives alone, just above the tea shop. I shall, with great anticipation, look forward to hearing what the theme of Sunday's sermon will be this week. Would he dare do one about fidelity or chastity? I won't be responsible for laughing out loud if he does. Speaking of church, last week after services, both our intrepid Constable Freddie Allen and that dashing Lucas Davies were asking after you. Any message you would like me to pass on to either of them? Make sure you are eating enough to keep up your strength. Love, Aunt Ivy.
Letter number 3. To Gwen from Aunt Ivy.
11th of February 1951. Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. Dear Gwenny, hello darling girl. You sounded tired in your last very short letter. I worry about you working too hard. You are so much at your studies you barely have time to write your favourite aunt. I can think of no other reason for the lack of proper mail. I am sure that will be rectified shortly, though. Mrs. Owens and I have been getting the guest room ready for your Easter holiday visit, and also talking about the menu. I know it is months away, but I am so excited to see you again. I am not the only one looking forward to seeing you again. Should I plan on inviting any special guests for dinner while you are here? Thank you for the one letter describing your essay on Women in Post-Industrial England compared to Postmodern England. I honestly did not understand it very well. How can we be postmodern? Modern is now. To be postmodern would be in the future. How does one write an essay about something that hasn't happened yet? Are you allowed to just make things up? I shared it with the ladies of the Women's Institute at our monthly meeting. Most of them were as confused as myself. Miss Brooke Turner, the local librarian, said she thought your essay most clever and babbled on with some nonsense. I don't think she understood it any better than the rest of us. She just wanted to look smarter than she is. She didn't go to university, now did she? Most of the ladies were interested in talking about the Archers. Have you been listening to this new drama on the wireless? It is giving us plenty to talk about. How pleasant to have new things to discuss besides when is rationing going to end, the King's health, or Mrs. Gibson going on about Mr. Gibson's battle with gout. There is only so many things one can say about gout. The woman is a bit tiresome. Our recent meeting, held at Miss Turner's home, was a very interesting one indeed. A stunning thing happened, Gwen. I had to use the lavatory. However, someone else was occupying it, so I had to wait. Located next door is Miss Turner's bedroom. I got a little bored just standing in the hall, and I began to pace. I happened to pace into her bedroom, just by accident, you understand. Next to the door is a chest of drawers, and the top drawer wasn't quite closed. I was trying to be helpful and close it for her, but it opened up on me, and I happened to look inside. There was a photo of a younger Brooke Turner with a handsome young man. On the back side of the photo it read, Rebecca and John Harrison, 1939, Brighton, honeymoon. What is all this? Miss Turner came to our village as a single woman. Do you think you could use any of that fancy education of yours and figure this mystery out? What is the true identity of the president of our Women's Institute chapter? Not only is she hiding her identity, but also other items in that drawer. They were shocking. She had these lacy, silky, incredibly revealing undergarments. She is supposed to be a respectable village librarian, and under her proper grey and flannel suits are items that I would only expect to be worn by women who earn their bread selling their virtue. I won't be able to look at her the same again. Do you suppose she is one of those socialists? Alexandria Gastrell asked me over for tea. She and her husband, Mr. Caleb Gastrell, are the ones who live in the big manor house. Mr. Gastrell fancies himself as a squire of the village. He is the only one who sees it that way. I think he puffs himself up more than is good for a man. I accepted Mrs. Gastrell's invitation. They always put on a good spread, but I really don't care for them. You see, your Uncle Herbert did some business with them back in the day. Mr. Gastrell was attempting to get Uncle Herbert to join in on a money-making scheme involving a mine, I recall. This was several years ago. There is some paperwork lying about on it. Herbert had a bad feeling about the deal and in the end passed up investing, which was good because it all fell through and many people lost a good deal of money. I believe Mr. Gibson and Mr. Palmer the butcher both lost a bit of money. There were others as well. I cannot remember them all. Though I noticed the Gastrells didn't really change their standard of living. Herbert had some other things to say about a swindle. I am hoping they serve scones and that strawberry jam their cook puts up. It really is the best in the county. Mrs. Owens has made you a tin of biscuits. I am including them with this letter. Write soon. Love, Aunt Ivy.
Letter number 4. To Gwen from Aunt Ivy.
1st of March, 1951. Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. Dear Gwen, hello, niece. I don't appreciate the tone you took with me in your last letter. I am no busybody or common gossip monger. I am your elder, your father's only sister, and you may be about to add some fancy letters after your name. But as far as I am concerned, you are not too old to be put over my knee for a good spanking. Since we are each other's only family, I will make some allowances of temper and extend the olive branch of forgiveness. There are times I fear the sort of things you are learning at that university and what will become of you. I do not think that kind of language or attitude will be much appreciated by either Constable Allen or Lucas Davies. Which I heard that Mr. Davies was talking to that hussy Iris at the pub. I do not know who approached whom. I am sure she would latch on to any man who looked at her twice. Furthermore, he didn't ask about you after church last week. If you are still interested in him, you had better smarten up your ideas, young lady. You don't want to lose out to that mealy-faced Iris. She has nothing on you. Reverend Fernsby and his wife Jean came for tea on Tuesday. Mrs. Fernsby had the nerve to ask if I had coffee, because her husband was partial to that beverage instead of tea. I simply couldn't help myself. I had to have a little tweak at the pompous man. I told him I heard he enjoyed a bit of tea first thing in the morning, and perhaps my sources were confused. He almost choked on his biscuit. Coffee, indeed. Isn't that what socialists drink? Or foreigners? Good proper British folk like a cup of tea. In fact, it was a good week to play little tricks on folks. I was at the library and I saw Miss Turner with her back to me, and I said very loudly, "Rebecca!" She spun around and stared at me, her eyes as wide as saucers. She asked me to repeat what I'd said. I replied that I wondered if she had read the book Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier and if she could recommend it. I thought that was pretty clever of me. She regained her composure and admitted she had not read the book and thus could not comment on it if it was worth the time or not. But oh, she was shaken by that. Who is this woman? I wonder if I should tell the other ladies of the group. It doesn't seem sensible to have heaven knows who running our Women's Institute chapter. It might reflect badly on the rest of us. While I was over at the Gastrel's home, I remembered a little bit more of what your Uncle Herbert told me about the swindle. It seemed that Mr. Gastrel had asked all sorts of people to invest in his mine, somewhere in Africa. In the end, the mine was a bust and everyone lost their shirt, except the Gastrels. Herbert was certain that Mr. Gastrel had taken the money out from the company and had hidden it away, knowing that mine was bogus. Then, after it all went belly up, he waited a while and then reclaimed the money that he had embezzled from the company. This was all years ago. I think most people have forgotten, or at least put it behind them. I decided to remind them that not all of us are so quick to forgive past trespasses. Over scones, I asked if they recently invested in any new African ventures. That maybe the second time would be the charm. They seemed a little discomforted, but Mr. Gastrel just chuckled it away and said that he avoided overseas investments now, too unstable. But both were doing such squirming in their chairs you would think they were having fits or something. Mrs. Gastrel was kind enough to send me home with a pot of the famous homemade strawberry jam when I asked for some. Wasn't that very obliging of her? I will save it for a special occasion. Maybe your visit for the Easter holidays. Spring doesn't feel very far away now. We've had several days of sunshine as well as rain. The ground is beginning to turn green and crocuses, daffodils and primroses are blossoming in the gardens of the village. These little bits of colour are so welcome after a cold, dark winter. Miss Berrycloth has small bouquets of these early flowers in pots at the tea shop. Cheers the place up. Are there many flowers to see in Oxford yet? Have you looked up from your books to notice? You should. Take a break and make yourself a little bouquet for your room. It will remind you of home. Write soon. Love, Aunt Ivy.
Letter 5 to Gwen from Aunt Ivy.
15th of March, 1951. Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. Dear Gwenny, hello, darling niece. It is the Ides of March, time to beware of traitors. Of course, it is hard to know who is a traitor and who is your common variety Englishman. I've always thought the Bailey family belonged to the common variety category, and of course Iris is very common given her regrettable foray into unwed motherhood. Now I must wonder if the whole family won't be tainted due to her associations. I have discovered the identity of the father of her mystery child. I was on my way to the church to help with the flower arrangements when I saw Iris at the back door of the butcher's shop. You remember Mr. Palmer, the butcher. He is the one you might mistake for a bulldog in a tie. I have often suspected him of being a socialist. He is very high and mighty in regards to these meat rations. He gets a perverse joy in making sure we are only getting our equal fair share, like any good comrade. During the war, their son Silas did not serve like a proper man should, unlike my Daniel. Silas was one of them conchy fellows. Says he is a pacifist, and I admit he did fire warden duty in London during the Blitz, but I still say he is only half a man. He did not do his duty to our country, nor to Iris. I can hear you asking what proof have I? I have the proof of my own 2 eyes. Silas was trying to hand her a package from the back of the stoop of the shop, which clearly contained illicit, non-rationed meat. She shoved it back at him and told him, "You weren't there for me then. I want nothing from you now." She was all huffy and the like. He tried to placate her and told her to take it, that she knew that his parents made things impossible. She stomped on his foot and walked away. I still think she is a hussy, but I do admire her spirit. He just simpered back inside like the weak, cowardly worm he is. Afterwards, I finally got to the church to work on the flowers. I struggled to keep my composure when the first person I saw was Mrs. Bailey sorting the flowers and ribbons into piles. On the other side of the table was Mrs. Palmer. The two were doing their best to ignore each other, as if the other wasn't in the room, which is ridiculous in such a small place. While I do enjoy playing with the flowers, and I feel it is important to fulfil one's Christian duty and help out at the church, it is really for the conversation that I partake in the floral arrangements meeting. I asked Mrs. Palmer if her husband had finally started competing with Mr. Gibson's unsanctioned sales of goods. She puffed up all high and mighty and rejected such a notion, wondering why I would ever think such a thing. I put her in her place quick enough. I said that I had seen young Palmer peddling his wares with Iris on the back step, and didn't the two of them look thick as thieves? Oh, how Mrs. Palmer turned pale, and Mrs. Bailey turned beet red. The radio doesn't offer such amusing entertainment as they did. There was more colour on them than on the flowers. Sadly, we are still using dried ones at the moment. But Brooke Turner, also known as Rebecca Harrison, said that the fresh flowers would be up soon and we could perhaps use them in the altarpieces as early as May, perhaps even April. Mrs. Fernsby offered up her foxglove. They grow in the cemetery, which is a bit ghoulish, I suppose, but they get wonderful sun and bloom at least 2 weeks earlier than anywhere else. I hope you're not missing regular church services just because you're away at university. God sees all, my dear, and I will see you at Easter. Love, Aunt Ivy.
Goodness, Aunt Ivy certainly knows how to get under people's skin, doesn't she? Letter number 6, to Gwen, from Aunt Ivy.
1st of April, 1951. Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. My sweet Gwenny, greetings to you, my only niece and living relation of any worth. Your recent letter and its news has left me a bit downhearted, I must admit. Are you certain you must stay in Oxford during the Easter holiday? I know you want to prepare for your last exams. I understand you've been working towards this for many years and want to make sure all goes well at the end. Of course, you desire to do well and make your family proud. You are a good, smart and hard-working girl. I want you to excel. But I miss your face. You look so much like your father. You have the same eyes. When I look into those lovely blue eyes with flecks of green, I see both of you at the same time. I miss him, your uncle and cousin. Rabbit Hill Cottage can be a lonely place during these celebratory seasons. I will have your room ready anyway. If your plans change and you find you can come down, even for an afternoon or one night, I shall be so happy to have you. I had all these menus planned, but they can wait until after your graduation, I suppose. I plan to put on such a celebration here, and we will invite half the village. We will go to Clark's Ladies' Goods and get you a new frock. Or perhaps I will even make a trip to London with you. It has been a while since I've dared to venture that far away, but you are worth the journey. I wish you all the luck, my dear girl. I know you will earn those firsts for sure. Mr. Gibson has announced a halt to his sausage and bacon sales for at least a fortnight. There has been some difficulty in his supply chain, or some such rot. This news caused a queue for porridge at the post. I was able to get one of the last boxes. That Silas Palmer had the nerve to show his face in the shop, and while we were having a good moan about the rationing, he made a statement about all of us needing to do our part. I would have thrown that box of porridge at his head. Except he would have kept it, and I would have been without my breakfast. I foresee dark days indeed for the village, until Mr. Gibson returns us to our usual good humour. Mrs. Owens this past week was lamenting that she has not seen any activity of the vicar at the back of the tea shop. No glimpses of him holding hands with Miss Berrycloth before making an early morning escape. While she disapproves, it does provide a certain amount of entertainment. However, Mohammed may not be going to the mountain, but it seems the mountain has been going to Mohammed. A few days ago, I went to the cemetery to lay flowers for both Uncle Herbert and Daniel, when I saw some movement in the back hedgerows, the part known as the Lovers' Corner. It is rather distasteful for a section of a churchyard and its cemetery to be given such a lurid name, and to carry the dishonourable distinction as a place for a romantic tryst, but that is the way it has been for generations. I must admit that even your Uncle Herbert and I made use of the hedge for a kiss or two in our heady youth. Hearing a rustle from the hedge paused me, and I recalled those misty days of the past. I got lost in a private silent reflection for a few moments. The lovers must have thought I had gone, because they emerged and looked shocked and terrified when they realized they had been observed. Who were these young loves' dream coming out? It was none other than Reverend Fernsby and Miss Berrycloth. They didn't even attempt to conjure a lie to justify their being together. Squawking, she fled in the direction of the main square, and mumbling incoherently, he ran for the church. Really, what an example he is setting for his flock. I am thinking I may have no choice but to write a letter to the bishop and let him know. Perhaps I shall warn Mrs. Fernsby and give her a chance to get her husband under control before I pen such a letter. That is the charitable thing for one Christian woman to do for another. It is possible she is unaware of her husband's dalliance, and thus has not brought him to heel. I will see her at the next meeting when we work on the altar flowers in 3 weeks' time. I can manage to have a private word with her then. Yes, that seems sensible. Mrs. Owens is sending you a double batch of biscuits this time. She was complaining about my listening to that swing music again. She warned that if people found out, they would start to think I was a socialist. I told her she was full of nonsense. No one would ever question my traditional values. Gwen, Mr. Glenn Miller isn't a socialist, is he? Love, Aunt Ivy.
Letter number 7. Our last letter to Gwen from Aunt Ivy.
22nd of April, 1951. Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. Dear Gwenny, hello, darling girl. Thank you again for coming home. It was wonderful to see you, even for just one night. I was delighted to share Easter services and supper with you. If I had more notice, I could have prepared a finer meal. Now that Mr. Gibson is supplying us again, I could have made sure to give you a proper breakfast instead of porridge. I wish you could have stayed longer, but I know you are anxious about this last Trinity term and sitting your final exams at St. Hugh's. I am wishing you every success. I want to assure you once more that I didn't mind at all you going for an evening walk with Constable Freddie Allen. I understand your need to divide your time at home between different people. You never did share. While on your stroll, did you end up at the Lovers' Corner in the cemetery? Does Freddie know that Lucas Davies carried your valise and acted as your escort as you walked to catch the morning train back to Oxford? I swear I have not said a thing to him. But, given the daggers he has been shooting Mr. Davies around the village, I am sure he knows. I told you, in a village, nothing is secret. I would like to reassure you that I approve if you end up with either gentleman. They are both upstanding men who know their pleas and thank yous. Neither have ever given me a reason to suggest they should be avoided. I suppose if I had to pick one myself, I would select Freddie. He has kind eyes and is a man who doesn't seem to be in love with the sound of his own voice. But either would be an acceptable match. You could do far worse. Neither one seems to have any objection to you being so educated either, which isn't that a wonder of the modern age. Have you gotten any further on our mystery of Brooke Turner, also known as Mrs. Rebecca Harrison? I am certain she suspects I know something. On my last visit to the library, I asked her about the novel Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm by Kate Douglas Wiggin. It was the only other Rebecca novel I could think of to tease her with. The joke was on me, though, because she did have it on the shelves. I ended up having to check it out, or I would look ridiculous. I surprised myself by actually reading this children's book, which I must admit was rather charming, if a bit overly cheerful for a woman of my years. Miss Turner will be at the meeting for the altar flowers today, as will Mrs. Gastrell. When I last saw her, while we were both at the post, she asked if I had used the strawberry jam yet. I confessed that I had not, that I was saving it for a special occasion. I should have brought it out when you were home for Easter, but it was such a fly-by-night visit that I forgot all about the jam. In fact, I had forgotten all about it again until writing this letter. Perhaps I will no longer wait for a significant event, and just make a batch of scones and eat it up. It has been so warm of late, it is perfect scone and jam weather. Mrs. Bailey and Mrs. Palmer will be in attendance at the meeting, both trying to not look at each other as usual. They are absurd. In a village this small, you cannot get away from anyone. I have half a mind to ask Iris to come with me, just to put a cat amongst the pigeons. Mrs. Fernsby, the Reverend's wife, is leading the group. I will be looking for a moment to have that private word with her. Woman to woman, you understand. I saw the foxglove in the cemetery getting ready to bloom, just as Mrs. Fernsby predicted. It looks like we have plenty of fresh, lovely flowers for the arrangements. Remember, your room is open and ready for you when you are finished at St. Hugh's. How wonderful it will be to finally have you home for good. You will fill the house with some needed youthful spirit. We can play those Mr. Miller records of yours and scandalise Mrs. Owens. I appreciate your reassurance that swing music is not a socialist affectation. I look forward to your next letter. Make sure to get out and enjoy the fresh air. Love, Aunt Ivy.
Letter number 8. To Gwen, from Constable Freddie Allen.
18th of May, 1951. Upper Stock Green Police Station, England. Dear Gwendolen Armstrong, I can't find the words to tell you how sorry I am about your Aunt Ivy's passing. I remember paying a call on her with my mum as a boy. Your aunt rapped my knuckles for touching things I shouldn't have. I was so angry at her I pouted and swore I'd never cross over her doorstep again. Then she stuffed me 2 extra biscuits that my mum would never have allowed me to eat at home. Just like that, all was forgiven. She had a way of managing children. They broke the mold after they made your aunt. I know we didn't have much time to talk or visit while you were here. You were in a rush to get to Oxford, and everyone was crowding you at the church. I couldn't get close to you, it seemed. Broke my heart, seeing you so sad. It somehow made you seem even lovelier than you normally look. It was well enough we didn't attempt to go for a stroll and talk, because your beauty left me mute. Sadly, that is not why I am writing, however. My purpose is more official. I know I said that you were overreacting and just feeling guilty about not being home when you suggested I should do a post-mortem on your aunt. That I said she simply had a heart attack, and that was horribly sad, but perfectly normal. I'm man enough to admit when I am wrong. You were right, and I was wrong. The post-mortem you requested was done. She was poisoned. I can still hardly believe it's true, but I've double-checked the results. What made you question it in the first place? According to the report, the poison was digitalis. That is a medicine given to patients with heart conditions. However, when someone without a heart problem takes the medicine, it can give them a fatal attack. I'm asking to be clear. Your aunt did not take digitalis, did she? I did not find any tablets or cachets in the house, and when I asked Dr. Brewster, he said he'd never prescribed such a medicine to your aunt. You were right to worry and ask questions. As of now, I am treating this as a suspicious death. I've gone back over Mrs. Owen's statement of the day. It was the afternoon of the 23rd of April. Your aunt had asked Mrs. Owens to bake some scones and serve them for a treat. While Mrs. Owens was making the scones, your aunt went to the post to mail a letter. According to the Baileys, who confirmed seeing her aunt, she did indeed get a newspaper and buy a few odds and ends. There's no listing of what specifically she purchased. The Baileys didn't remember anything that wasn't her usual shopping. At the moment, it doesn't seem significant. Mrs. Owens said she took the scones out of the oven just after your aunt left the house. Leaving the scones to cool, she popped out and headed to see Mr. Gibson. She claims it was just to have a chat. I know she was buying black market sausages. I am not a fool, but I'm also not going to put half the village in jail for illegal bacon and sausages. Oh, does everyone think I am so thick that I don't know about these backdoor trades? Let's be honest, no one even tries to hide it. I don't think people here are very crafty at hiding their secrets. Anyways, Mrs. Owens returned from her chat about 30 to 45 minutes later, the best I can narrow her down. However, I get the feeling she may have been gone a little longer. She's awfully cagey about the whole thing, but even 3/4 of an hour seems a bit long just to pop over to the pub and get her sausages. In her statement, Mrs. Owens found your aunt on the floor of the dining room upon her return. She was unconscious. The doctor was called, but your Aunt Ivy was gone by the time he got there. He pronounced her dead at the scene. Scone crumbs were resting on the plate. Mrs. Owens did a count of the scones and relayed that 2 were missing and presumed to have been consumed by Mrs. Stevens. A good-sized portion of some strawberry jam was gone as well. Mrs. Owens was certain it was a fresh pot, never opened before. These are the basic facts, according to my notes. I will question her again and see if she can shed any more light on this situation, given its increased seriousness. I promise I will do all I can. If there is anything I can do for you, Gwen, let me know. I understand it has been a struggle for you, trying to arrange the funeral and your aunt's affairs while having to finish your last term at uni. I still can hardly believe you're going to have a degree. I hope you won't forget us simple folk when you're part of the intellectual elite. I still remember when we would scrump apples together from Mr. Smith's orchard. Maybe, when this is all over, in the autumn we can go for a walk and eat a few of those apples for old time's sake. Regards, Constable Freddie Allen.
Letter 9. To Gwen, from Mrs. Owens, the housekeeper.
21st of May, 1951. Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. Hello, Gwendolen. I worry about how you are doing in Oxford. Those professors don't seem like very nice folks. I think they should have given you more time off to properly grieve your aunt's passing. But I will admit I know nothing about how things are done in the hallowed halls of higher learning. I never finished secondary school myself, though I got along just fine and can't say I have any regrets about the matter. But you are a cleverer girl than myself, so I guess you know what you're doing. You handled the funeral very well. Your aunt would have been pleased with the turnout. I was glad to pitch in and help with the refreshments after the service. You seemed plumb worn out. Thank you for keeping me on as the housekeeper. I will make sure the house is in the same tidy and good order that I did for your aunt whilst you were away. You can always count on Mrs. Owens. Speaking of dependable, Mr. Davies came by and made sure everything was settled in regards to the household accounts and such. He is such a gent. He told me to come and see him if I needed anything at all, and that I should tell you the same. He is not only a steady sort of fellow, but rather handsome as well. I may not be young any longer, but I've got eyes. The house is currently spick and span, not a bit of dust to be found. I've begun the spring clean. Rabbit Hill Cottage is ready for you at a moment's notice, in case you need a place to rest and get away from Oxford before those exams. The only difference between when I worked for your aunt and now for yourself is now I am locking doors. After what happened to your aunt, I must say I am fearful that someone might try and do the same to me. The constable came by and said that she was murdered right in her own home. To think of it, who could do such a thing, and why? I know your aunt was perhaps a little fond of other people's affairs, but to be killed for it is too shocking. We aren't safe in our own beds anymore. What is the world coming to? I am a little worried they might come for me as well. What if I know whatever it is that she knew that got her done in, and they try for me next? I won't sleep right until they're caught, that's for sure. So if you come for an unannounced visit, make sure you bring the key, as I am locking the doors now. Another reason I write is this murder business. Now, I have known you since you were a little slip of a thing, but I want to make it clear to you that I had nothing to do with your aunt's death. There are some vicious tongues wagging in the village at the moment, rumours saying that perhaps I did her in, given that I was out of the house and it was only her who had the poison. But it just isn't so. You have to believe me, Gwenny. I would never hurt Ivy. I will tell you exactly what I can remember. I have maybe left out a few details in my statement to the constable, but he is a man, and who can fully trust a man? Your aunt requested that I make the scones that morning to go with the fancy strawberry jam from the gastrolls. I was bending over to remove them from the oven when I heard a snap and felt a pain in my back. I also felt a bit of a sag on the front of my chest, if you know what I mean. I was so embarrassed, and I am full of shame as I write these things to you. But at least you are a woman and can understand these things. My brassiere strap had broken. Now, perhaps if I was a small woman, like your aunt, I could have done without such an item of clothing, but I cannot go without that kind of support. After I left the scones out to cool, I grabbed my coat and handbag and headed over to Clark's Ladies' Goods to purchase a replacement. After that, I went over to the pub and got our usual order of sausages. I cannot say for certain how long I was out. My best guess is that it was close to 45 minutes or an hour. It was almost immediately after I returned that I saw your aunt on the floor in the dining room, and I called the doctor. It was 10 o'clock at that time. I hope this puts your mind at ease over any thoughts of my guilt. I couldn't live with you thinking that I killed your aunt, even as a passing idea. If there is anything else you need from me, you just ask. Your aunt was very proud of you. She bragged about how her niece was going to have a degree in history to anyone who was around. I wanted you to know that. Look after yourself. Sincerely, Mrs. Morgan Owens.
Letter number 10 from that handsome solicitor, Lucas Davies.
25th of May, 1951, Upperstock Green, England. Dear Gwendolen, when I left you, your bewitching eyes were such quivering pools of sadness. Don't be embarrassed about requiring a handkerchief. I like thinking about you having it with you still. I hope it will keep me in your thoughts as well. I was pleasantly surprised that you took the time away from your crucial studies to have supper with me. You are even more captivating in candlelight, my dear. Your tears brought out the white knight in me. When I offered to render you any service you required, I could have not been more surprised if you had asked me to slay a real dragon than your actual request. However, I have done as my lady commanded. How did you know that Miss Brooke Turner's real identity was Mrs. Rebecca Harrison? I've been living in the same village as her for years, and I had no idea she wasn't exactly who she portrayed herself to be. I thought she was just another lonely spinster librarian. I never would have thought her a tragic, mysterious widow. Alas, I'm getting ahead of myself. Given the information you gave me, her real name, that she was married to a man named John, and that they were honeymooned in Brighton in 1939, which was not a great deal of information, by the way. But since I am a very clever and capable man, I was able to gather a few facts for you. I would have preferred to deliver them in person, over another candlelight supper, but I know you are awfully busy and would want this post-haste. Yes. 1. Rebecca Small married John Harrison in 1939. They did honeymoon in Brighton. The only reason I know this was because of a news article I found about his death, which was newsworthy because he died on their honeymoon. According to the article, she came back to their hotel room after going for a walk on the pier by herself, and she found him lying on the bed, non-responsive. She called the hotel doctor, but it was too late. They said his ticker had given out. But that is very strange for a young man. There were questions about what really caused his death, but his distraught widow insisted on moving his body back home for burial as soon as possible. I couldn't find any more on what happened after they left Brighton, but with the war starting and all that, I don't know that people care about one dead body when the nation was on the verge of an international crisis. I don't know how she went from being Rebecca Harrison to Brooke Turner. I can keep investigating if you would like. Just send me word. I'm yours to command. In response to your other questions, other than the small bequest your Aunt Ivy made to Mrs. Owens, which isn't very large, all of her worldly goods go to you. So the only one with financial motive is you. Should I try keep that quiet from the police? I don't think I can. Though I doubt the constable has any designs on you, well, not for being the killer at any rate. You asked where I was and what I saw the morning of the murder. I had breakfast consisting of porridge, alone, as usual. Eating breakfast alone is when a man feels the loneliest, I think. When he really reflects on not having a wife on the other side of the breakfast table. I also reflected on not having any bacon, and I remember it was my time for a ration allotment. Around 9 o'clock, I went over to the butcher's to get my allowance of breakfast meat, and I know for certain that Mr. and Mrs. Palmer and their son were in the shop, because there was a bit of a row between the old Palmers and the lad. I heard Miss Palmer utter the words to the effect of, "We said no and we meant no, you'll ruin us all." She was rather upset, causing her face to turn in a flattering shade of red. She stomped into the back room after that display and left Mr. Palmer and Silas to wait on us customers. Can you believe, after all that, they were out of bacon? It was a wasted trip. I had to go back the next day to get my ration. In response to the question you haven't asked, yes, I am pining away for you here in Upper Stock Green. When are you going to come home and end my misery? I need to be taken in hand. I await your next communication with bated breath. Yours forever, Lucas.
Letter number 11 to Gwen from Freddie Allen.
29th of May, 1951. Upper Stock Green Police Station, England. Dear Gwenny, you went to Lucas Davies for help. I told you I was sorry about not listening to you when you thought something was suspicious about your aunt's death. I swear I'm doing my best to get to the bottom of what happened. I am using every resource at my disposal, as meagre as they may be. Are you still mad at me? Or do you think I'm too incompetent to do my job? What can I do to get back into your good graces? Maybe this will help. Which, if you could keep this between just the two of us, I would appreciate it, this not exactly being by the book, you understand. First, let me address the issue of one Miss Brooke Turner, our indomitable librarian. That was a bit of a shocker. How did you find out that she was really Rebecca Harrison? Next time you're in town, we're going to have a long conversation one way or the other, my dear. Your facts are correct. Rebecca married a John Harrison in 1939, and they honeymooned in Brighton that summer. Mr. Harrison died from heart failure whilst on said honeymoon, according to the death certificate. Rebecca went home as a young widow and buried her husband. Sounds very sad to me. I talked to the local police. It seems when she returned home, the rumour mill started going full force. There was a good deal of speculation over whether Mr. Harrison was helped along to his great reward in heaven, or if it was natural causes. He was very young, but these tragedies can happen. Then the war began. The copper I talked to admitted they didn't ask as many questions as they could have to solve the mystery one way or another. Most of their force was joining the fighting, and it just got swept under the rug. The locals, however, did not forget, and the innuendo about Mrs. Harrison being a murderess, well, only got worse as time went on. It seems that finally our Mrs. Harrison had enough, so she changed her name and moved away. That's when she turned herself into our Miss Turner. Alas, this doesn't clear her or prove her guilty. She could be a killer on the run, or just a woman trying to find a haven from the gossips. Second, we do know your aunt was killed by digitalis. I have more real evidence about that clue. I've been compiling a list of people who take forms of the drug as medicine for heart ailments, according to Dr. Brewster. I've been comparing them to the names of people you and Mrs. Owens gave me as possible suspects. A side note, seriously, how could your aunt have that many people holding a grudge against her? She always seemed such a nice, sweet old lady to me. Anyway, the list. Here are the individuals. Mrs. Fernsby, Mr. Palmer, and Mr. Gastrell. Did your aunt really think Mr. Palmer was a socialist? That's what Mrs. Owens shared. He is a shop owner. He is a picture of capitalism. Third topic. I am thinking seriously of becoming a farmer. I was ready to dismiss your accusations about Iris Bailey, Silas Palmer, and a baby out of wedlock, but since I'm trying to get onto your good side, I meekly followed your orders and looked into it. You were right again. I found a birth certificate for last year that listed both their names. The birth took place at a cottage hospital, miles up north, apparently. Mrs. Bailey's sister lives not far from there. I've not tracked down the location of the baby yet, but they did indeed have one according to the paperwork. Also, the sisters working at the hospital confirmed it. I'd no idea those two were stepping out, or that Silas Palmer would be the kind of fellow to let a girl down like that. I've shared many a pint with him at the pub. Won't be doing that any more. Though I am starting to question my own professional ability to do this job. You seem to know more about what's going on in this village than I do, and you're gone most of the time. Maybe I should hang up my helmet and pick up some pruning shears. We can talk about it when you're finished with your degree. I've wanted to visit you. Interest is not the reason I've stayed away from Oxford. But I know how seriously you take your education, and I've been busy with the investigation. I didn't want to bother you. But when you're done at the end of June, I'd like to have dinner with you. I have many questions to ask. There is one question in particular I really would like an answer to. It will keep until you're finished, though. If you require any further assistance, please ask me and not a certain solicitor we know. Stay safe. Yours always, Freddie.
Letter number 12. To Gwen, from Mrs. Owens, the housekeeper.
3rd of June, 1951, Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. Hello, Gwendolen. I hope this letter finds you strong in health and hearty in spirit. I've just returned from Sunday services. Reverend Fernsby gave a very impassioned sermon on forgiveness and the fallibility of man. He assuredly knows a great deal about the topic to preach about it. Your aunt would have laughed until she fell out of the pew had she been there. I missed having her next to me to giggle over it with. A very odd thing happened as I was leaving church. Mrs. Fernsby cornered me in the churchyard. I was almost out of the cemetery when she started the conversation with the usual pleasantries, but she was as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Eventually, she moved the conversation to the same theme of forgiveness that the good Reverend had sermonized. She was beating about the bush so badly, I suspected we would be there until the following Sunday at the pace she was going. If I didn't get home before the sunset, my roast was going to be as dry as a bone, so I finally told her to get to the point. I never used to be so bold. I think it is all the years in service to your aunt. It has rubbed off on me. I'm not sure if it's a good thing or not. I used to be such a mild-mannered girl. Her point was infidelity. It seemed that your aunt had approached her about the affair that was going on between her husband and our innocent-looking Miss Berrycloth. I still have a hard time seeing Ada as an adulteress. She always has been so kind and generous. I remember once when I had a terrible cold and cough that put me in bed for days. Well, Ada mixed together this concoction of herbs and flowers and tea for me to drink. She knows all about these traditional ways, doesn't she? She came over and brewed them up all day for me. The next day I was feeling like a new person. You just don't imagine someone as nice as that having an affair. But I saw her and the vicar in a lover's embrace myself. I shared my observations with your aunt. Now, Ivy, being the bold one, confronted Mrs. Fernsby over her husband's behaviour. It was unseemly to have the minister of a community behaving in such a manner, and him supposed to be a role model and the like. Your aunt threatened if the affair didn't stop, she was going to write to the bishop and tell him what was going on here in Upper Stock Green. Mrs. Fernsby wanted to assure me that she had talked to her husband. The Reverend did call it off with Miss Berrycloth. In fact, he did it the very day your aunt passed. Mrs. Fernsby wished for me to be aware of all of this in case I was thinking of making good on Ivy's threat. I promised her that I believed her word and I would not be writing to the bishop. I think your aunt was going a bit far with that threat, but I've learned when to keep my own counsel with your aunt. While walking home, Mrs. Bailey fell into step with me, and she shared what her husband had told her this morning over their breakfast. It seemed that last night at the Quivering Leaf, your Mr. Davies and Constable Allen were having strong words. The constable did not like that Mr. Davies was putting his nose into things that were not his concern, and Mr. Davies didn't think that Freddie had the right to make himself judge and jury on what was and wasn't his concern. They almost came to blows. Thankfully, Mr. Gibson stepped in and sent them to opposite corners to cool off. Goodness, with all this important news, I almost forgot to address what you asked about in your letter. You wanted to know if I saw anyone out and about while I was going to Clark's Ladies' Goods and the pub the morning of your aunt's passing. I have given it some thought. This is the best of my recollection. I may have missed some things, mind you. I was a bit distracted about my brassiere situation and trying not to be seen by anyone. I do remember seeing Miss Turner outside the post office picking up a newspaper as I rounded the corner. While I was walking the high street, I saw Ada Berrycloth. I didn't call out, which I normally would have, but as I said, I was trying not to be seen. Thankfully, she didn't call out to me. She was pretty focused. She looked as if she was heading towards the churchyard. After I left Clark's and arrived at the back of the Quivering Leaf, I did see Mrs. Gastrell. She was just leaving with her package of meat, and we nodded politely towards each other. She didn't stop to chat. She seemed to be in a hurry herself, and I didn't try and engage her in conversation. She usually has little of interest to say, which is surprising for someone who lives in such a fine house. I would expect her to be clever, but I find her rather dull. I did not see anyone coming or going from Rabbit Hill Cottage, but I was gone for about an hour. I hope this is helpful. As I reread what I have written, I can't imagine I saw anything important. Your aunt had been planning a party to celebrate you earning your degree. Just some cake and sandwiches, mind you. She wanted to invite the usual villagers over. Would you still like to do something like that? Let me know. I can arrange it all. Though perhaps it would be best if you only invited Constable Allen or Mr. Davies, given their behaviour at the pub. Everyone is wishing you well. Sincerely, Mrs. Morgan Owens.
Letter number 13 from Mrs. Owens, the housekeeper.
8th of June, 1951. Rabbit Hill Cottage, Upper Stock Green, England. Hello, Gwendolen. I can hardly believe that in a fortnight you will be home for good. Has it been 3 years already? You should be so proud of yourself. Gwendolen Armstrong, B.A. in History. Are you going to have cards made? I think you should. I would if I were you. Some folks in the village might think that you were filling yourself with airs and graces, I suppose, but those would be the jealous ones, mind you. I know you said you didn't want a party to celebrate. I don't think your aunt would feel it is in bad taste. She so wanted to put on a show and honour your accomplishments. But if you were sure, then that is that. I think it's a shame, but I am only a housekeeper. I've been tidying things up for your arrival home. I was going through your Aunt Ivy's desk. Well, it was your Uncle Herbert's desk before Ivy began using it. Now it will be yours, I suppose. I wanted to sort some things and make room for your papers. In one of the upper drawers, with the ration book and the collection of your letters. Your aunt liked to reread your letters, did you know that? She did. Anyway, there was a strange document titled Geological Survey. I couldn't understand it. Remembering how kind and smart Mr. Davies is, I took it over to him to explain. I hope you don't mind me taking the liberty. I will report to you everything he related to me. It was a survey of a mine in Africa. The paper was dated June 1935. This was that mine scheme that Mr. Gastrell was trying to get everybody invested in. People were putting in their savings during the spring of 1935. It seems your Uncle Herbert sent a fellow out to check out the mine. The report spelled out that the mine was exhausted, that there was almost no more ore to be gotten out. Several months later, the mine enterprise went bust, which of course it would if there was nothing more to be gotten from the ground. I remember that time. It was a dark period around the village. People were having to cut back and pinch their pennies. Your kin did okay. They didn't put any money into the venture. I do recall that Mrs. Gastrell would be taking trips into London in 1936 and coming home with bags from Harrods and Selfridges. This was the same time others were struggling to make ends meet. It wasn't right, that was for sure. Mr. Davies is certain that Mr. Gastrell would have had a survey also done of the mine. He must have known that he was playing people for fools. How terrible to do that to your neighbours. Since this paper was in your aunt's drawer with your letters, I can't help but think that she was aware of this as well. I wasn't sure if I should worry you with all this, with your exams almost upon you. Though knowing how you are about these kind of things, I figured I should tell you straight away. Isn't Mr. Davies such a gentleman for helping out? He didn't care that I hadn't made an appointment and didn't even charge us for his time. He is awfully fond of you and always has such nice things to say about your aunt as well. I am sure she would approve of him. Let me know what train you will be catching when you come home. Sincerely, Mrs. Morgan Owens. P.S. Oh, Gwen, it seems I may have been misled about Mr. Davies. Last night Mrs. Bailey came over for a chat and a nip of gin. I know your aunt and her did not get on, but I have never had a quarrel with her myself. After the gin had been in her a while, she shared some information with me. The day of your aunt's death, Ivy went to the post office to get a newspaper, send your letter and get a few things. That I believe you already know. But it seems Ivy was detained on her way home. She and Mr. Davies had a conversation in the street outside the post office. Now, Mrs. Bailey didn't hear all of it, but there were raised voices, and she came out to see what was going on. Ivy was telling Mr. Davies in very stern terms that if he wanted to court you, that he should take care of the company he was keeping at the pub and avoid certain hussies. Mrs. Bailey blushed something fierce at this point. She knew Ivy meant Iris, but neither of us spoke this out loud. Then Mr. Davies took exception to Ivy's interference, and he told her that she was a nosy busybody, and to keep out of his affairs, that he would see who he liked, when he liked, and how he liked, and that included her niece, that being you, dear. Your aunt was furious and headed back home in a huff. I bet she made that tea and ate those scones to calm herself down. Oh, how dreadful. I hope I did right telling you. I always thought he was such an amiable fellow. I hope the murderer is found soon. I won't sleep easy until it's solved. Tell that Freddie fellow of yours to get a move on.
Letter number 14. The last letter in this series. To Gwen from Constable Freddie Allen.
15th of June, 1951. Upper Stock Green Police Station, England. Dear Gwenny, one more week until you're home. I don't know if the days are going to fly by or drag endlessly. I am determined to give you the arrest of a murderer as your graduation gift. I know it isn't a traditional present, but you're not a traditional kind of girl, are you? In case you are in doubt, that is one of my favorite traits of yours. I bet you eat steak and kidney pie for breakfast and eggs and toast for tea. Maybe you read your textbooks while standing on your head, thus getting more oxygen to your brain, and have a rule about only wearing green on Tuesdays. I would still think you the most spectacular girl in all of England if you did. I'm changing my suitor hat for my constable helmet now. I finally got the report back from Scotland Yard. I sent all the food and dishes in for analysis. There was digitalis in both the tea and jam. Whoever did this wanted to make sure someone was dead. The doctors at the yard surmised your aunt would have died about 20 minutes after ingesting the poison, give or take a few minutes. It seems poisoning is not quite an exact science. I've been questioning again the list of folks you gave from Mrs. Owens. It would be easier if people would be willing to speak more frankly to me. She withholds evidence just because she can't say the word brassiere in front of me. You know how silly that sounds, right? How this makes my job more difficult to do? But I am a man of my word. I will not mention it to her, for your sake. You know I would do anything for you, right? I had a man-to-man chat with the good Reverend Fernsby. That man almost broke down in tears when I confronted him about his affair. Didn't deny it. I guess a reverend doesn't get much chance to open up and confess his own sins instead of listening to other people's. He took this opportunity to unburden himself and ran with it. He admitted how it had been going on for months. Usually they're meeting at Miss Berrycloth's flat above the tea shop. Again, how was this happening in my village? And I didn't have a clue. Fernsby also confirmed that his wife had been scolded by your Aunt Ivy and threatened with exposure if it didn't stop. The morning of your aunt's murder, Fernsby met up with Miss Berrycloth at one of their usual meeting places, the Lovers' Corner in the cemetery, which I am never going to look at that bit of hedgerows in the same way again. He told her it had to end. She begged him to change his mind and instead run away with her. He refused, saying that he couldn't abandon his wife, career, and position, not even for love. She was thoroughly upset and left in tears. He slunk into the church to pray for their souls. How am I going to keep a straight face in church after this conversation? I had a very terse exchange with Miss Turner. She recalled being at the post office the morning in question, getting her usual newspaper. She remembered seeing your aunt inside. There was no exchange between them. I got the impression Miss Turner was avoiding Ivy and wanting to make sure there was no chance of an interaction. Obtaining her paper, she left quickly and claims to have headed directly to open the library. Your aunt was still inside the post when Miss Turner left, but she did remember passing Mr. Davies on the street on her way to work. I'm not sure her statement is of much help, but you never know. Lastly, I went to the manor house and questioned Mrs. Gastrell. I was lucky to find her husband not at home and could talk without his pompous interruptions. Agitated is the best descriptor for her. I'm not sure if it was due to guilt or a feeling that someone of her station was above police questioning. If she wasn't jumping up to ring for tea, she was pacing the floor or wringing her hands. The woman wasn't still for a moment. In between all this fluttering, there eventually was an admission to her being at Gibson's that morning. There were witnesses who could place her there after all, but under no circumstances would she admit she was buying black market goods. She claims to have returned home immediately after visiting Mr. Gibson, but there are no witnesses to support or refute this. She was even more cagey about the pot of jam she'd given your aunt, though she had to admit that she had given it to your aunt, because we already knew that. There were many assertions that the pot was fresh and unopened when she gave it to your aunt, but we can't be certain, can we? When I asked her why she was willing to part with one of her prized jars of strawberry jam, especially to someone who wasn't her closest of friends, she stammered some nonsense about Christian charity. That is a guilty woman, but that doesn't mean she's guilty of murder. I'm close, I can feel it. By next week, I will have this case solved. Plan on having that dinner and talk. I've been waiting patiently, Gwen, but a man can only wait so long. Yours still, Freddie.
And now the conclusion of To Silence a Scandalmonger. Let's review key events, shall we? Ivy Stevens was killed by digitalis poisoning on the morning of the 24th of April, 1951. She began the day by asking Mrs. Owens, the housekeeper, to prepare scones to go with the pot of strawberry jam from the Gastrels. Ivy left Rabbit Hill Cottage to go to the post to get her usual morning paper, send off a letter, and buy a few items. Mrs. Owens left shortly after to go to the women's clothing store and then the pub to get sausages. She returned no more than an hour later to find Ivy dead on the floor. The jam was open, some was missing, as were 2 scones. After testing from Scotland Yard, it was revealed that the jam and tea had digitalis in them. Now, who would have wanted to kill Ivy Stevens? Ivy had been reminding the Gastrels of the scandal of their failed mine. Did they know Ivy had proof that they had ruined their neighbors financially while they embezzled their way to riches and wanted to keep their secret? Was Brooke Turner afraid to be run out of town a second time, accused of murdering her husband, who died young of a heart attack? Mrs. Fernsby had been threatened with public exposure of her husband's infidelity by Ivy. Did her or her husband worry that ending the affair wouldn't be enough? Or perhaps the mistress, Miss Berrycloth, trying to protect her lover? Or the Baileys, in an attempt to hide Iris's shameful secret of a baby born out of wedlock? Hopefully you've narrowed it down to one of these 4 following suspects based on who was seen out and about on the morning of Ivy's death, for they had motive and opportunity. The Reverend Fernsby and Miss Berrycloth were spotted having a tryst in the Lovers' Corner in the cemetery, where he claims he was ending the affair. Mrs. Gastrel was seen engaging in a bit of black market meat procurement at the back of Mr. Gibson's pub, and Miss Turner was observed by several at the post office that morning, and she left before Ivy. She stated she was heading straight to the library, but did she really make a stop before getting to her destination? It was one of these 4. Now it is time to make your final selection for who is the murderer. Last week's letter from Freddie was not the final thing he sent to Gwen. He had gone to the cemetery to visit Ivy's grave and saw the foxglove growing there. Cutting some flowers, he took them home to press. He then sent them with wishes of luck to Gwen. As Gwen opened the envelope at table, a passing botany professor commented on what lovely digitalis purpurea she had, but encouraged her to keep it away from her food. She asked him to explain, and he informed her that digitalis was the Latin name for foxglove, and it had poisonous properties. Gwen immediately called Freddie to share this development with him, causing our intrepid constable to recall the many herbal teas he had treated his mother to at Miss Berrycloth's tea shop. She was brought in as a suspect. When pressed during questioning, Miss Berrycloth fell apart and confessed that she had indeed poisoned Ivy. Ivy was the reason her love affair with Reverend Fernsby was ending. After the Reverend broke it off and told her why it had to stop, in a blind rage she grabbed a stalk of the foxglove and returned to her shop, and with practiced hands she ground the petals and leaves in her mortar and pestle. This had taken her only a few minutes. In a state of fury, she rushed to Ivy's house, unsure of exactly what she would do until she got there. She thought it was divine luck that no one was home. She snuck into the kitchen and put the poison in the tea and jam, which were set out for Ivy's return. With the lethal trap set, she fled the scene, surprised at how easy it all had been. Freddie was indeed able to present the murderer to Gwen for a graduation gift. The trial is beginning shortly, and in case you wondered, the wedding is planned for September. I hope you got a kick out of To Silence a Scandalmonger and Playing Detective. A huge thank you to the talented and generous efforts of all my voice actors. This could not have been done without you. You brought my characters to life and gave me such joy. Merci beaucoup. Aunt Ivy was played by Diane Fox-Hill and Katie Sutcliffe. Freddie Allen was played by Barnaby Wykes. Mrs. Owens was played by Louise Colley. Lucas Davies was played by James Edward O'Reilly. This serial was written, narrated, and produced by Jacqui Lents. Some of you may have noticed a little author oopsie. I stated the date of Ivy Stevens' death as April 24th. My bad. It's April 23rd. There's no significance. I just made a mistake. If you noticed it, kudos to you. You are a super sleuth. If you didn't, there's nothing wrong with you. I didn't catch it till later myself. Sorry about that, folks. But I just wanted to make a clarification in case anyone was wondering or concerned. I hope you've enjoyed this series as much as I have. Remember, you can follow on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, and iHeartRadio. Or you can find me, like, and subscribe on YouTube. My regular episodes come out every other Thursday. I hope you will check those out as well. Until next time, I wish you well.